The last speaker we have is Charles Landry, and I think if there's one person who you probably do know in this list of speakers, it is Charles. It's good to hear we're awake, and now we have to be attentive again. And I mean, asking Charles to speak in an event like this is like opening for not one tap but several taps. You never quite know what is going to come out, because he produces things constantly and is rethinking all the time. Although he has kept on the same, you might say, track, the same direction for the last more than, I suppose, 30 years. And he was his Creative City publication was really, at its time, a document or a collection of thoughts, which is really one of the most impressive, but also the most important for many people, among others myself, some 25 years ago, I think it was. When was it actually published?
Well, the big one in 2000, the smaller one with Franco in whenever it was, 95 or so.
It was 95, wasn't it? Yeah. That was the year before I was doing the Cultural Capital. I think you actually came there to do that. And Franco told us yesterday this idea of the creative city, you heard it first mentioned in 88. Was it 88 you said?
No, it was actually 1990.
1990, all right. And that was something to do with maybe with Glasgow, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, that's another time. Okay, Charles is back to tell us what's happened in the meantime, and with his many different publications. And this idea of the civic city in a nomadic world sounds really enticing and really interesting. But you also at one point talked about we're not going to get anywhere with this alternative planning, alternative future thing, unless the bureaucracy starts to think differently. So you made a publication on that, which I also thought was really interesting, and talking about how it really is important to engage with the bureaucrats, engage with bureaucracy, and actually talk about how to make that creative. And that was a discussion we also had yesterday, very much, whether to turn your back on the bureaucrats and go separately, or to actually infiltrate and still believe in it. So you'll probably be touching on that as well. And the other thing you might be touching, what was the other thing, Charles? The psychology in the city, which I just mentioned, is about how you have to understand the city as a very, very complex thing, but actually you might say, meta-psychology of the city is always really irrelevant. So I'm not quite sure where you're going to start and end, but it seems as though you're on the right track with the future. And who's that sitting there?
It's at the Olympic Park at the end of the Olympics.
Okay, all right, that's great. All right, okay, well, thank you very much for flying all that way, and thank you very much for coming back. And you know Helsinki quite a lot, and also Espoo, because you've been actually guiding their thoughts on their cultural strategy, I believe. Okay, good. All right, thank you, Charles.
Well, thank you very much. As you can imagine, I love being here, and this place in particular is like a zen. Out there is fantastic. Anyway, I apologise not for coming earlier. Of course, I would have preferred to be here all the time. Anyway, that's life. So I'll just go through a bit of a thing. I mean, basically, we all know that the world is moving faster, we're eating faster, we're walking faster, we're trying to think faster. Whether we're being clearer or not is a completely different question, as we all know. And this whole idea of the civic city and the nomadic world in one sentence is, where do we belong, or I belong, or what's my identity, etc., when everything is on the move. So where do I belong when everything is on the move, and perhaps there's less stability than there was before? And I've tried to put this together in this civic city in the nomadic world, and you can see in the cover there's a sort of fracture in the picture, and it's that fracture that I'm so interested in, is how that could be healed. Easy to say, of course very difficult to do. And this movement is absolutely astonishing. This is at the end of the UN Quito Habitat meeting, which is every 20 years, as you probably know. And what that did as its main conclusion, and you know obviously the UN is a national entity, nation states, for the first time at a global level, I mean all of you have already thought about this for 20 years, said it's really cities that they're important hubs that will probably find many of the solutions of the problems that we are creating. And they had then a manifesto with a lot of words, 10 main points, which you all know of, so I'm not going to tell you, inclusive, etc., etc., etc. But one of the issues which was very interesting in Quito is that power, corruption, money, all of these words that are so important were never mentioned once. And so it was never asked, well, why is it not like this? We all roughly know the types of places we want to live in, but that question was never answered, and that was very sad. But anyway, this image is just trying to reflect on the fact that there are a hell of a lot of people moving around all the time. And here is just arriving or leaving from Shanghai Station. And so this, when I began to see these images, I kept on thinking images, experiencing them, I kept on thinking, shit, what's going on? And that's also why Chris Murray and I, some of you know Chris Murray, we've been obsessed a bit about we affect the city and the city affects us. It's so bloody obvious that it does, and that is a psychological dimension to this. But if you look at city making, the subjective, the emotional, all of that is never really fully inside the city making process or the disciplines. Occasionally people have a study about environmental psychology or so on, but it's never really embedded inside, and it never really touches upon what is happening inside the brain as we experience these environments. And as we all know, as we walk around, there are some environments that say yes to us, but some say no. And that's why I think and feel that everybody is a city maker, because everybody has some view along that spectrum. I know I'm simplifying, between the yes environment and the completely no environment. But certainly people have begun to wake up to these sorts of things, but not enough. That's what I would conclude there. But I think the big issue, or the central issue, or one of them, is, of course, as we know, and I'm sure Franco, I can just imagine Franco yesterday going along like this, the world is turning to its darker phase, apprehension is in the air, whatever, the zeitgeist is one of rising anxiety, the grey zone disappears, which is obviously true, that the grey zone is disappearing between, the black and white. Everything is black and everything is white. And so, of course, this is not really fun and is really difficult. But one thing that I felt was always quite interesting in that context, because obviously, in a sense, the creative city idea and notion is to try and say the glass is half full rather than half empty. And so even though all of these things are going on, it's important to see how we can recapture, because in this recapturing, when the grey zone disappears, is when we feel at ease with ourselves, and that's really what the psychological work shows us, our social self comes out much more. The fact that we want to then connect in certain ways. When we feel overwhelmed, our tribal self takes control. And so it's always a battle between our social self and our tribal self. And of course, we've noticed politically that the tribal self has taken over more. And I was always inspired by Patrick Geddes, just this quote that is here. A city is more than a place in space. It's a drama in time. And I think we all know that, because all of you are sort of city investigators. You wander around cities and we can see that drama. And I suppose the 4 big points within this civic city nomadic world business is that the world is in motion, and I'll try and elaborate that in a minute. But of course the city is in motion. It's always being made and remade continuously. And in that making and remaking, of course, these destructive processes, some of which are good and most of which, or many of which, are bad, is really interesting to explore. And it took me about 35 years to work out one sentence, which I'm about to tell you, which is: creativity is a renewable resource. heritage is non-renewable. Obviously, its interpretation can be renewed. But it's precisely the balance between these, working these through, these tensions, which I believe does create great city-making, because, of course, it's not about either or. One obviously has to develop in one way or another. I'm not saying you do this. This happens to be Groningen, which is a city in the making, in a spot which is actually very old-fashioned. But the third thing about the city in motion, the world in motion, is, of course, in how do you generate places of encounter? And when I say places of encounter, it can be, of course, that public space, but it can, of course, permeate into that ever more private space that leaves behind it. And then the fourth question I'm asking myself is, okay, we're in this moving situation and we've got these places of encounter. How do we then create a place of empathy where that question that I said about our social self or our tribal self, that hopefully the social self comes more into prominence? So let's look at this a bit more closely as a totality. We have, I think, the return of the nomads. Of course, there was always a nomadic life, and we fantasize about some aspects of old-fashioned nomadism that is disappearing incredibly fast. But there are new nomads, and it's not just the hipsters, of course, we'll come to those in a minute, but it's nomads in all sorts of sense. When we move from one place to the next, the question is, what are the places we're moving to? And as you all know, the dynamics, the global dynamics of cities leads to a series of places that you could call vortex cities, where like a maelstrom, it sucks in often the more interesting people, perhaps, not necessarily so. The more ambitious, definitely so. It sucks in finance and so on. And what that's done has completely transfigured the way the urban global system works. So if we just, for a moment, just restrict ourselves to Europe, of course it is a global phenomenon, you see certain places, London is obviously one, but the Berlins, the Amsterdams, now the Lisbons, and soon the Athens, are sucking in everything. And those processes create a completely new form of pressure, which I'm involved in something called Cities Under Pressure, because of the speed at which that's happening. And obviously one of the main points is the absolutely astonishing speed of global capitalism as it sucks itself into those cities, particularly Chinese and Russian finance, which is buying up whole areas, which is creating immense problems in cities, as you know. So that's just one movement. But the question about these people, these individuals, many of us probably represent some of these individuals, is we leave from, let's say, a smaller place and we go perhaps to this vortex city. Will we go back to that smaller place, to that secondary, tertiary, etc., city? Which is why it's so important, for me at least, because the way the urban system works, and obviously technology helps, is that those other places that are not those become as interesting as possible. And there's a lovely project in Germany called Happy Locals, where one of the key guys in Berlin who founded Tresor, which is one of the big clubs like Berghain, you'll probably know those, has got this project called Happy Locals, which is trying to keep all of these folks that are apparently so interesting back in their small localities. So the question for a city planner, for example, in terms of identifying where are we, is really to ask, what is this churn between these people who are coming in and out? Are the interesting people only going in, interesting in quotes, to those hub cities, or are they also coming back to the others? And this question of the talent churn, or the churn, is an indicator that is never used, but it's so easy to identify. You just need to ask people, are people leaving or coming, etc., etc. And so these old and new nomads come in very different variations. And if you just look at the city, you can see them here. Happens to be Berlin, but what I liked is this backpacker guy has got something, all these cities on his bed, Vienna, and the other edge, you can't see it, is Sao Paulo, by the way, just so you know, etc. And, you know, you see them in airports. This happens to be this Copenhagen. It doesn't matter where they are. And when you look at these people, this is Istanbul, you can see the whole working arrangements are changing. And so suddenly and slowly, we know this already, of course, we're saying the classic corporate structure that we're so used to is not necessarily the place where many people want to be. And I caught this guy, and what was so interesting, you know, it's a coincidence when you're so obsessively taking photos, suddenly I saw that later he had a bag called Roots, and this exemplified for me everything about this sort of movement that we're talking about. But what is quite interesting is within this movement, and we'll be much more specific shortly, even banks are changing. This is the main bank in Antwerp. Antwerp is quite an interesting place, as you know, quite big, 600,000 people. And this is the main bank. And the first 3 floors of this bank is this. So the bank, you cannot see the bank anymore. The bank is somewhere else. It's up there. Because the bank realizes that if it's going to connect with the sort of people it needs to generate the resources ultimately, it needs to connect with them and create spaces for them. The new main Deutsche Bank in Berlin, for example, you would think this is a yoga meditation zone. You've got no bloody idea what this is. You come in and it's sort of very cool and yes, okay, or what's going on? And then somewhere in the background, of course, there's someone who says, yes, do you want a loan, or won't give you a loan. But you know what I'm getting at. But these spaces could be also, of course, a library. And of course, as you see, what I'm talking about is the importance and significance of third places, neither home nor work, but also the street, and that's why the public realm is so important. But more seriously, there are more other people moving around. The guest workers. We all know that in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, only 14% of people are actually Emiratis. The majority, more than 75%, are from the Indian subcontinent. And they are, of course, they're not citizens, they're not citizens, full stop. They live in encampments. If you've been to these encampments, you know, it's all a bit sad. They go home perhaps once every 2 years, etc., etc. Their passport is taken away, etc., etc. And then, of course, there are the 80 million refugees. So when we talk about the world in movement, we often simply focus on the refugees. They're incredibly important, but there are 80 million of those, then plus 10 million stateless people, who are often, quite a few of them, are in airports who've been there. There's a couple of cases of people living in an airport for 2 years because they're completely stateless. But in terms of when you add all the types of people that are moving, and we'll come to these other types in a minute, some people say it could be 1 billion people moving at any moment. So the refugee is incredibly important, but it's only one segment of that. They may end up in all sorts of contexts. Like here, again in Istanbul, they'll earn their money in all sorts of ways, and you know much more about this than I do. But a very significant proportion of people who are on the move are students, and it was so wonderful. Umberto Eco wrote about the Erasmus program and say this is the best program in the universe because it's creating some sense that we're understanding each other. And then there was a study, you perhaps heard about it. I sort of jumped for joy when I read this. I didn't read the study, I read about it, which said apparently it's an EU study which says 1 million children have been born because of Erasmus. Now, isn't that amazing? That has created a level of intercultural understanding at one point, because far more people who go on Erasmus programs marry or fall in love or do something, whatever, with people from a different culture. Now, that, of course, sounds wonderful at one level, but it's also wrenching. It's wrenching because of where was my home, whose home am I going to go to, and so on. And so that's why I feel, although we love, perhaps here in this room, this sense of that diversity and movement, at the same time, it it is back to that question, where do I belong when everything is on the move? And of course, one of the biggest, we didn't see Chengdu, this is Chengdu, by the way. Forget Chengdu, this is just a typical tourist. The tourist movement is perhaps the most overwhelming of these movements, and that is for all sorts of reasons, just to, have fun and explore. But of course, of beauty and health. You probably all know the world capital of, butt lifting is Brazil, as you know. There's lots of beauty tourism, Costa Rica. There's countries that have vast industries on this, Poland for dentistry, Hungary for dentistry, and so on. So there's a hell of a lot going on. And then there's, of course, a darker side to tourism that you all know about. But what I find so interesting, and I don't know if you do too, is the promise of this globalization was diversity. The reality is so often sameness. If you look at these buses, they're all the same company. What is it? Madrid, Sydney, London, Toronto, Berlin, Istanbul. So there we are, all in the same buses, going around, owned by the same company, on a city sightseeing tour, which is fine at one level, but I'm just saying that question of the promise of globalization was diversity, the reality is sameness. Coca-Cola has 30 million outlets in the world. When Coca-Cola entered China in a big way, the CEO said, when he was speaking to the then president, saying we must try and get 8 million Coca-Cola outlets in China, which is quite something. I mean, 8 million, if we just put 8 million dots here, that would be quite a lot of dots. And of course, there are other things, obviously McDonald's, 35,000 of them, etc., etc. So there we have people on the move, we have products on the move, brands on the move, we have goods on the move, and there are more goods coming, of course, from Asia than here, which is why we have so many container cities in Europe, because there's so many empty containers, because we've got nothing to send back. No, actually, container cities are great, but you get the idea, they're very cheap to buy. And of course, something that is particularly on the move, and I'm not going to tell you which Italian town this is crime and criminality. The speed of criminality. If you look up the statistics of crime and the big mafias, one big Russian mafia group is actually the biggest, then of course the various Italian ones that collectively are nearly as big, and then the Mexicans. So that is again on the move. I'm just trying to give you a headache. Sorry about all this movement. So sorry about this. And so that is happening, and much of that is happening in nanoseconds. My designer was hacked, and he said he was trying to obviously establish, what was the source of it. And within about 12 hours, whoever was doing the work had shifted from Egypt, where it started, to India, back to Russia, and over to the States. So whoever this was hacking in a very sophisticated way within nanoseconds. And then, of course, not to forget, pollution is on the move as well. So obviously, as we all know, we're interconnected. And this nanosecond business I was talking about, the hacking, is also to do with, obviously, global financing. There was a line built between New York and Chicago, some sort of fibre line, and it cost, I think, 300 million, anyway, a vast sum of money, just to reduce the speed of the transaction by a fraction of a nanosecond, so whoever the trader was in that instance, in that automated way, could react. I'm only saying this because this is the world we are living in, and this is the world that is so out of control. This is the world that is incredibly difficult to feel that I have some sort of sense of, I can affect things. And then, of course, if you're rich, citizenship is on the move. The cheapest form of citizenship in Europe, as you probably know, is Cyprus. The cheapest in the world is the Dominican Republic. Anyway, you can buy citizenship if you want, so you don't have to go through all that hassle of 8 years living somewhere. And then, of course, English is on the move. And at one level, again, it's back to this point, it's great to communicate in various languages, in that language called English, but what about those other languages? What about the Finns here? Are you expressing yourself with your full self as you speak in English? Could you say it more subtly if we were all speaking Finnish, etc., etc.? So again, all of these things, as we know, are good and bad, and this is creating tensions in Berlin. I'm only mentioning Berlin half the time is because I happen to be living there for the moment, is that there's a big reaction to the cafes where people can't even say thank you. They can't even say danke. You know, there are people there who don't speak one word of German. And Soho House, so cool, Soho, all the people in Soho House in Berlin are not allowed to speak German. Oh, okay, thank you very much. So there are two sides to all of these stories, but perhaps the biggest move of moves is the one between the physical and the virtual reality. And that move, as you know, is incredible. It's obviously only just begun, and as it says here in Dublin Library, we spend more minutes in our virtual worlds than outside. So what I'm really saying is all of these things are happening in a way that is happening more rapidly. And perhaps the most important one is the one I've just mentioned, which is the dramatically immersive effect of the digitized world that is immersive, all-embracing, all-consuming, yet also fragmenting. And it's always these things, these balances that we all know about. The fact that, of course, as you know, what happens with swiping and all of that, again a psychological thing, is it releases dopamine in the brain, which is why we are so compelled to look at our mobiles, thank God I put it over there, all the time. Because there's a deep stuff happening in the brain which is making this all compelling. And of course, this is a dramatic breakthrough in every sense, which you know about. And it's quite interesting, of course, Google controls this. This is the Sydney Biennale. I bet they didn't realise I'd use this picture to show their dominance, which you get sucked into the Google train, into this Google world. But of course, that's why I thought it was so wonderful that the My Data movement, which you know about, which has a Finnish foundation, I mean, the big guys, girls who are into that, the first World Congress of the My Data movement was here in Helsinki, in Helsinki Espoo area. So saying, I decide who gets the data, not necessarily you. But nevertheless, this big data, we cannot hide from it. Of course, it's incredibly powerful. It allows all the sort of great things that happen, for example, in this Helsinki Espoo region here. But when the biggest hotel chain in the world, Airbnb, owns no hotel rooms, when the biggest taxi company in the world, Uber, owns no taxis of its own, when the biggest media producer in the world, Facebook, produces none of its own media, then we know that the world has dramatically transformed, which is why people, of course, talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And to repeat the sentence again, it has only just begun. But within all of this, of course, it allows, I think we might be visiting, I'm not sure if we're visiting the startup sauna in Aalto in a minute, but of course, part of all this enables the startup sector to operate. It enables the sharing economy because, of course, if we only on average use a hammer 1% of the time, or a car on average, I think 12% in Europe, of course, it enables that sharing to happen. And it was so interesting when in 2000 Helsinki was capital of culture, they had shared bikes, but because the technology wasn't good enough at the time, they kept on being stolen, whereas now it's much more trackable and so on. So that's enabled this. This is Turin, where you can do bikes, cars, vans and so on, and all enabled through the phone, as we know. So, in all of this, how do we connect? Shallow and deep. My personal view, and I may be wrong, is that ultimately the civic comes from a hell of a lot of small, often shallow, small incidental encounters. And it could be one of these encounters that start like in this particular place here. The encounter, so to some extent we use big words like community, and I think community is obviously important, but when I think of its beginnings, leaving aside that if you're in a village you've got no choice, it's often these small incidental things that build into a bigger story. And that can be in all sorts of ways. I'm only showing this because this is in fact precisely the street where the bomb in Istanbul happened. That trust that is being exhibited here between police people and those residents is of course now in these newer contexts actually endangered. And this leads to some extent to all sorts of potential parallel lives. And it's on the one hand, as we all know, that if we are a community, let's say Somalis, a taxi driver yesterday was a Somali, and I asked him who does he know, and he said, well, I'm 32, I tend to know only Somalis as my friends, but my younger cousins who are 15, they are connecting very strongly with Finns and so on. But so we all understand that one often wants to have one's in-group, but in the city, of course, in theory, is also a place of connection. And the stark examples we know everywhere, this is, of course, Jerusalem, where those fractures are so dangerous. So it's really about how to avoid that, which is back to my point, about how do we create places of encounter. And these, of course, this is all cultural projects, and I'm sure you've discussed those all over the last few days. And how here, this is a video shop in Penang, so don't worry, but how do you bring these different views together that often have views of life that are fundamentally different? So in this that I'm describing, this nomadic world, some people think, of course, it's completely invigorating, and others think the opposite, which is why we have that sense of apprehension is in the air, the world is turning to its darker face, and so on. But if you add it all together, I think we are, or the world is, in the midst of being completely redesigned. And the question really, in all its facets, politically, legally, because a lot of what I said has massive legal implications. And the question is then, what is our view, our vision of where next? And given the technological side of things, you know, I didn't talk about artificial intelligence and so on, but that's why I'm saying it's only just begun, is how to keep the human perspective centre stage. And that can express itself in all sorts of ways. I happened to be in Antwerp the day after that French outrage, and this is the museum. And I think in that museum what happened was the rabbi and the imam both together collectively entered that museum, and this thing lit up, which is of course a digital process, an artistic process, which was incredibly emblematic at that moment. And so I think what we're really talking about is how in a world that for so long has been ego-driven, and of course we know the Western notion of the individual and all of that, is how can we do things that is beyond the self, while still feeling okay about being myself, not pretending we're all so lovey-dovey and so on. And it was quite interesting, I think, when the Fata Creative City came out in 2000, I wrote something and I said, the contours of the next wave. And in it, I said, the next wave is civic creativity. And civic creativity is a form of imagination applied to public purposes that uses the entrepreneurial spirit we associate with individuals, with that sense of a bigger whole, that sense of wishing to bend the market to bigger picture purposes. And that, to me, as we know, and Franco will have gone through this story, obviously this creative city thing started very much with a focus on art as art, and then has widened out, and for me, it's very much now also about the bureaucratic stuff. But how do we see that? How does the environment speak to me in such a way, because we're back to psychology, that I then feel I want to be back and be civic? And one of the things I've noticed, when there is generosity, public generosity in space and place, and you can feel that generosity, psychologically people are at the edge, more likely to be friendly, nice, or whatever, positive, than its opposite. And you can see these signals. This is just somewhere in Ireland, and that's a movement, you know, the random act of kindness movements. And of course, the big question, and all of this, is will the fragments ever make a bigger whole? Will these fragments, all these lovely examples that we know and that are happening everywhere, and when you take a helicopter view of them, you feel the world is really transforming, and it's not got a darker face, it's got a lighter face. However, what are the organizational systems that bring the fragments together, that they're powerful, when political parties and all of these other systems and institutions have broken down? How does one bring the fragments together when we know that with the right attitudes and the right atmosphere, this can happen? And I just think this is quite interesting. This woman was called Shahana or something. She's Indian, and she said free hugs. And I thought, oh, shit, I'm embarrassed. But I do want to take a photo of her. What do I do? So I hugged her. And appropriately, this was at Frankfurt Airport, where she's offering free hugs, and that sort of symbolized all this nomadic bit. But there are other examples, and I'm just, you know, slowly going through a couple. Is Bologna, and you've heard probably many of you know, the Bologna regulation of 2014, which is about the urban commons, which is setting a framework, a public framework, where facilities are jointly managed by citizens and the authorities. This is being copied by many and has been inspired. It inspired, anyway, a lot of people, doesn't matter, just look it up. You know, in Portugal, in other countries as well. And that, again, is something that sets a framework within which, of course, projects can happen. But that's why I'm saying that ultimately, yeah, we want the project, but you want sort of legal mechanisms that are entrenched and embedded that make this that normalize this. Otherwise, it's always just a project. Oh, it ended at the project. It was a very interesting project. Thank you very much. I was part of a project for 2 months. Thank you very much. But having something where you are then, in this particular case, a joint manager of a facility, in theory forever, creates a totally different context. Here's another example. I mean, these are just snapshots, and I'm sorry, but my main point about it is really this question of this political. This is in Bogota. This is a hip-hop group, which, as you can see, is about hip-hop for peace. And they really taught me a lot, because I somehow felt hip-hop was only aggressive and all of that. But these guys there told me about the roots. But it's intergenerational hip-hop, and it's also men and women and all of that, girls and boys and stuff like that. And their whole aim in this favela is actually to generate peace through hip-hop. Sounds very contradictory, but it's not. And you will, of course, know Medellin. Anyway, you know Medellin, and you know it's turned and become the poster child of urban reinvention. And funnily enough, the mayor of Medellin was where I was yesterday. And what he said is two incredibly important things, because everybody was saying, why can't we do this? And why can't, you can imagine what they were saying. Why is the UN Habitat Agenda not happening? And he just said two things. He said, interestingly enough, and this is in contrast to Britain as an example, we do own the electricity and the water company. And because of the profits of the electricity and the water company, we can do things like build these escalators, like build these fantastic libraries you know about, which have been, you know, all of this stuff that has helped reduce crime. Because 25% of our income comes from that. That's point one. And secondly, it's no surprise, he said the only important thing is we made a political decision to give the poor the best. The moment we decided to give the poor the best, plus a few other 100 things, that thing about the violence began to turn around. So in the end, as you all know, we are talking politics. And then I do want to mention your region, because this thing, which is not a thing, of course, I don't know what to call it, because it's in Helsinki, as you know, and it was built in the World Design Capital. So what do we call it? Do we call it a reflection space? Do we call it a what? But I've been in there many times, and this is social services and the Lutheran Church. You'll correct me, Timo, if I'm wrong. Yeah, you're nodding, yeah. And if you go in there, sorry, if you haven't been in there, go in there immediately, but slowly. And that, to me, although there's nobody there, is actually generating that feeling that I could be or wouldn't mind being with someone else, which is back to my point about the civic, that which we do together. And anyway, so these signals of the civic, you see everywhere. They're building the new metro here in Berlin. And even these tiny things, this goes on for 500 meters with different images just going down. So you could call it street art, or you could call it urban messaging, or trying to generate this spirit of generosity. In other words, what am I saying? I'm saying in simple terms, the city is a communications device. It talks and speaks through every fibre of its being. So much of what it says is obviously a bit not too good, but what it could say could be interesting and could generate the dialogues, that sense. And this is here, this is Lisbon, as you can see, the city of tolerance at a point where Jews were killed and so on. So in all of this, and I'm just thinking about what I've learned over the years, I mean, I don't know if I've learned anything, but if there are 5 points that I think are important beyond people wanting to have a job or you know, just have some basic income. And these constants seem to me that people want anchorage, the familiar, the tradition, heritage, whatever, all those words that are about that is and was. Who am I? The tree that is still there. Whatever, the house that is still there. But then they want the opposite. They want possibility, can do, choices, option. They want this place. So this great place has anchorage, possibility. I can make more of myself. I can be connected internally and externally to the outside world in very varieties of ways. I can have some sort of sense of growth, personal growth. I can become and be the full sense of what I could be. And fifthly, I mean, they don't say these words exactly, but I'm abstracting, and I think this is what people are saying. They want inspiration. And inspiration simply means that you can lift yourself up into another register. That inspiration may historically have been the church, but of course, the sort of projects that I gather I see in that program that you're doing, the artists and so on, could equally be that lifts up into a different register. And that register could simply mean that I understand things better, but it could also mean I lift my sights. So, yes, it is about the past and all of that. It is about all of those things. It is about possibilities. It's, of course, because the city in its essence is a place to meet, to talk, to do things, and then occasionally to sort of do something a bit extra. And the inspiration thing, I'm back, I'm just using the visual version of inspiration, could be something like this was an old library in Rio de Janeiro, which just in a very cheap way was redone. And when you went inside, you just could feel that this is a place, this is a library reinvented. This is not the library as the dull place that so many talk about. So where does that leave us? How do we create these conditions for people to be and to become their full selves? You know, it's easy for me to say these sentences, bloody easy, I know that. And the question is then, how is that relates to the identity? But I hope what I've tried to say is to be their full selves, is to try to be more their social selves rather than their tribal selves. That's really, and then I'm saying once more our social self, then a number of things can happen. Now, city making is in fact a contested art. It took me a long time to think this through. I know it's obvious perhaps to you. Of course city making is a contested art. Planning is mediation. So often planning is defined as something else, but the planning today, the discipline of planning, which is obviously varied, it's not only physical planning, is essentially about a mediating difference. And the examples we heard this morning from Lucy were partly about mediation between different people who didn't know each other and so on. And then I saw this, and when I nearly said, this just sort of lifted me into the sky. This is in Zurich, and they're regenerating this area where all the eBays, Amazons are up this Zurich West, and there's this hotel called the Renaissance Hotel. And there was one person, one artist who resisted in that building, and he put resistance in the same writing as the Renaissance Hotel. And that is the essence of urban transformation, that problem. Now that guy had so much problem that in the end, unfortunately, this building was just torn down a year ago because he had so much hassle and let himself be bought out. But nevertheless, he provided the world with this image that summarizes the essence of these places. And the places where I think interesting things happen are often quite unusual. You look at it first sight. This is the old Philip factory in Eindhoven, Strype S, and you see that and you think, oh, that's cool, that's a hipsterish area. But the company that owned that, Trudeau, that did this transformation of these parts of the old Philips factory, also owned 1,000 buildings of the Philips workers over there. The school in that place, because Philips declined, everything declined, was shut down because heroin was being sold, all of that. You can imagine the context, etc., etc., etc. And he said, we need a game changer, this guy called Tom Alsom. And he said, okay, I will get some students and offer them a deal that they can't refuse, which is you can live there, and 180 accepted, it's 180 houses, and you get such a special financial deal that you will really want to do that. But the deal from your side is that you give 20 hours a month to this community. Teach them Dutch, teach them maths, teach them art, whatever it is. 4 years later, that school and this area is completely transformed, and the school was voted the best apparently in Brabant, which I don't know how many people live in Brabant, a few million and stuff like that. So quite often, the game changer, the cultural understanding that creates the game changer is odd things, like in this case, do a deal, you get it cheaper, but you give 20 hours to do something. So are these spaces and places, I don't know why I've got this picture of Nokia inside the building, I think just because I'm in Espoo. Why have I got that? I don't know. Just to say that of the places and spaces, this is another place in Paris, that we think are the places where the vibrancy happens, often do not look like this, even though they look beautifully sanitized. And here, just in passing, is that bank, the Deutsche Bank, the entrance to that bank that feels like a yoga center that I said before. So, that's why all of this, these tensions between the construction industry that build things like that, La Défense I just showed, and all of that, is why, of course, we see this resistance. And this is why I think, and what I like about this event you've got, is that city making is a cultural project. Again, easy to say, difficult to do. And of course, that cultural literacy, I think you're using the word culture much more broadly here, is both there to decode, but also ultimately perhaps to inspire. And the event I was at yesterday, you know, in passing, you know, I kept on seeing the word cultural planning. I think we made a mistake, and it's quite often your mistakes you can only see retrospectively. We should never have called it cultural planning. It was a wrong word. It should have been called planning culturally. I mean, in English, cultural planning, planning culturally. And I never use the word cultural planning, although I agree with the essence of what it's trying to do. But I believe it's planning culturally, which is to do with this literacy, this understanding of the essence of where people come from, where they are, where they might wish to be and become. And what was interesting, the event I was at yesterday, which was the Inter-American Development Bank, which is part of the IMF, which sounds very dull, there they have a division which is called the Culture and Creativity Division, linked to urban development. Now, if you just think about the processes of trying to get a bank like that to install a division that has that title, you may criticize lots of things about it, but I think that's at least a step forward. So in terms of this cultural planning, culturally thing, have we moved forward or not? I just don't know. Some signals like that example I'm just giving now would suggest that we are occasionally moving forward. But what's so interesting is the meeting places. We all know that this big danger, which is why I talked about protest, is that the places that people want to be in now and create often look so different. This is the Holzmarkt in Berlin, which is 250 meters on the main riverside on the Spree, which was transformed by a group of people, it looks like this and this, by people who owned a squatted nightclub called Bar 25, and they created such a protest that they got a series, an insurance company, the foundation of Abendroth, which is an insurance company, a Swiss company, to help them buy the land. So they bought the land so they could do this. This is not profit maximizing, as you can see, but there are a couple of anchors which make money to balance the books. But what there has been now is a movement which has happened here, and then another part of Berlin, this is another nightclub, which is of foundations coming in and buying key properties and taking it out of the speculation market, which is back to my cities under pressure thing. Because in the end, it's all very good doing the project if you don't bloody own the thing, or at least have an angle on the assets, or, like Medellin, have enough revenue coming in to be able to have leverage over the forms of development, because otherwise it's all that just being a protest. And the protest, of course, we all agree with. So there we are. We're in this movement area. Things are moving. We're in a startup area. Yes, yes, yes. All very good. What is the key element? The key element is back to what we've already known, and which is why the world's darker face is so difficult, is the city obviously needs experimentation zones. If you were a private company and someone said to you, do you have an R&D department? And you said no, they'd say, are you mad? Are you trying to go bankrupt? The city needs exactly these same experimentation zones, and some of it will be rubbish, but some of it will be wonderful, and some of that alternative will become the mainstream that itself will be challenged at another point and become I don't know what. Or some of the best of that was an innovation will become mainstream, will become heritage, that then needs to be connected with new innovations and so on. But that's the process, a dynamic process of city making. And I think that that really is the key issue. And that is not easy because it requires a bureaucracy, firstly, to agree with it, and secondly, to accept it. And as you all know, and I won't say anything about this, we're of course moving from representative democracy to participatory democracy. And of course that's about harnessing collective community intelligence. And what's so great, of course, about Nordics countries is you've got so few populations, you better harness the whole population. If you've got 80 million, you might say, okay, let's leave 40 million behind. I mean, I'm not saying that's what countries do, but sometimes you feel they do that. So how that happens will happen in different formats. You've talked about it all over the weekend. But when we now turn to the bureaucracy, which I think needs to enable this, you need to move from a no because to a yes if culture, which is so incredibly easy to say, but difficult to do, because what that implies, Because precisely that movement I described about the city making and the innovation labs and so on, when this is turned into legality, it becomes slightly rigid. So, for example, you have an intent or a principle, but often that is a suggestion. It becomes a suggestion, a recommendation, and a rule. But then when it goes into the bureaucratic process, that rule, suggestion, is treated as if it's law. And that is the danger, because what we're trying to do is shift from we're trying to keep intent, and that often means having the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. But when a structure, which is normally hierarchical and doesn't allow failure, it forces people to have the tendency to shift a suggestion into a law, which means that the systems are rigid. Added to which, of course, there is the silo thing that people here have been talking about for 30 years, so we say nothing more about it. But I was in one of these boxes and I didn't like it. And what we're then doing in this reshifting is moving from a predict and provide model, this is in terms of the planning process, which is the traditional process, to what I call elastic planning. And elastic planning is to be strategically principled and tactically flexible. What that means is there are three things I really, really, really mean, and they are completely non-negotiable. How I'm going to get there, I don't bloody know. In general, I know this is the direction of travel. I need to, if I've got the principle, I'm going to be all right, because I'm always guiding it via the principle, which will help me to do that. And this then becomes, obviously has to be added to a sort of compelling narrative of the story of a place, and I'm sure you've told lots of people like that. You've told lots of stories like that. So just to summarize in 10 points, what I then think this new urbanity is that has this ethics in it, and it's all stuff you know. Nothing I'm saying is anything new, but I'm just putting it together for myself, is what are the lenses of that? The first, and I'm sure you've been talking about it all the time, I know Leah has, is integrated thinking, planning and acting. You've been talking about it, why do I need to say that? The shared commons and threats to it. Of course, this creative bureaucracy stuff. By the way, can I just tell you, we're organising the first creative bureaucracy festival in Berlin with the main paper. And anyone who knows any interesting bureaucrat who's had any solution to any problem, please let me know. Can you do it by... No, seriously, this is not a joke, yeah? This is being launched. This thing is being launched on the 28th of May at the Global Solutions Summit, which is a parallel summit to the G20. It's being launched, the creative bureaucracy idea and the festival. There's a founders meeting at the end of June with a few people to work out what the festival will be like, and in the autumn it's happening. But the only reason I'm saying it at this point with trust is because we want the examples. We need the example. The diagnosis is clear. We know the diagnosis. Everybody knows the diagnosis. What is the solution? Which ones have worked and failed? And the third point, obviously, cultural literacy that you've talked about. Intergenerational understanding and joint projects. These divisions, these spatial fragmentations, obviously we need to get rid of. Then being eco-aware. Again, I said you know everything about what I was saying. Addressing the divides, of course we know that. Healthy urban planning. I was so inspired by someone called Hugh Barton. I'm nearly finished, by the way. Have I gone on for hours? Sorry, I just was in a sort of loop. He added the word urban planning. He just put the word healthy urban planning. It's so simple. If you just always put in front of urban planning healthy, then somehow thinking about a city that makes you healthy rather than ill may be a good idea. And then the aesthetic responsibility. I just think it's so important to ask a developer, do they even know the word aesthetic, by the way? The aesthetic responsibility to show this generosity and this stuff that we're talking about. And then I'm really nearly there, I promise you, is of course I still believe in the creative city ethos, which is basically empowering an ethos. And in one sentence is how do you create the conditions for people to think, plan and act with imagination in creating solutions and solving problems. And then we need, of course, an invigorated democracy. But that in the context of the digital age. And I love this piece of Russian artwork. It means just really rethinking the rule system and so on. So some of that may or may not deal with this fault line, this fragility that I'm talking about in this nomadic world. And it is about the management of fragility. And that requires us to have this flexibility and this alertness. And so there I leave you. The conclusion for me, and again, you know, some words, 5 words, took such a long time to think through. The soft is the hard. It just took me so long to work that out. That building the infrastructure is easy, but the soft is the hard. So it's not always about money. Thank you very much.